All right. Hello, everyone. Quick couple updates. Just wanted to let you know, because I got a couple questions. I have finally gotten what is hopefully the most recent updated sheet of attendance from FI. So I'll go and put those into the grade book as soon as I get a chance so that you have kind of a midterm-ish update on how you're doing with those points in there. And the other thing to note, I mentioned it in the announcement, but it looks like our recording didn't work out on Monday. So I linked you to a bunch of places from last year's class where we covered definitely the same material in more or less the same way. So if you were relying on those videos for studying, feel free to go back to those. Otherwise, I'm sorry about that tech issue. But when we left off, we had broken our way into the endocrine system, and specifically we were talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So we had already covered the posterior pituitary, relatively easy because we've got these neurohormones that are coming directly from neurons that project into that posterior lobe of the pituitary. We're going to talk about the different setup that we have in the anterior pituitary. So we've got these hypothalamic neurosecretory cells that interact with this portal system, which is two capillary beds connected by a portal vein. So what we have happening is we've got these tropic hormones from the hypothalamus going into this bloodstream, getting to the anterior pituitary, where we then have endocrine cells that release their own hormones in response and head out to the body. Most of those anterior pituitary hormones are also tropic, meaning that they then also affect the release of hormones elsewhere in the body. We left off on a slide that looks like this, mapping out all our different hypothalamic tropic hormones, all our different anterior pituitary hormones, and how they interact with the rest of the body. Okay, so we can see the exceptions to that rule about anterior pituitary hormones being tropic is really just kind of prolactin. We don't see another hormone. And then our melanocytes affected by the melanocyte stimulating hormone. We don't have another hormone that's being regulated at the end of this pathway. But otherwise, we've got more hormones in all these pathways. So those ones coming from the anterior pituitary would themselves be considered tropic hormones. So this is a lot to look at. I'm going to give you some tips on how to break it down and how to recognize these. And we'll be going through the rest of the endocrine glands. So we're going to go through all those endpoints and kind of trace each of these pathways as we do that. But just thinking about how we would look at this while we have a chart in front of us, I'm going to ask a kind of practice question so that we make sure we know at least how to study from a picture like that. Okay, so looking at that diagram, I want you to tell me what happens when growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, gets released from the hypothalamus. Okay, so we got some options. I'll let you read through those. take a look and walk it through. Okay, great. All right. So for the correct answer, when we have this GHRH coming from the hypothalamus, it's going to happen as we send that down through our portal system to the anterior pituitary. So we have our next hormone in the line, growth hormone. We're going to start secreting more of that from the anterior pituitary. That is going to go into that second capillary bed, get sent out to the rest of the body. And specifically, one of the places that we're interested here is the liver. So we're going to see on that pathway, we got the liver secreting our insulin-like growth factors. Let's take a look at that on the map. So the pathway that we're following here is, let's pick a different color. Okay, we're following this pathway. So we're going from growth hormone releasing hormone to our endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary that release the growth hormone. And the pathway that we have described for us in detail is this one. So we've got going to the liver, insulin-like growth. So we're going to notice we can trace through all of these in similar ways. Right? So when you're reading this map, when you see these plus signs, that means that the action of the hypothalamic tropic hormone to increase the production of the hormone that we're looking at in the anterior pituitary. You'll notice that you have two places where you have a minus. So it's still a tropic hormone, we're still regulating, but in this case, we make less of the hormone that's next in the line. Okay. And we'll notice that because of that function from the hypothalamic tropic hormones, that they're always acting on another hormone's release, they actually all have really similar names. So if you look at the endings of the names, you'll notice we've only got really like two options. We've got RH and we've got IH. And that is on the end of basically every hormone in the hypothalamus that's going to our anterior pituitary, right? But that's because these are regulatory hormones, and we've tried to name them for what they do. So either they're helping us release another hormone, that's the RH ones, those are all more common here. The IH ones are all where we're inhibiting something, right? So this is where we're like turning off a signal. The ones that end in IH, this inhibiting hormone. So we do want to get familiar with the names of these actual hormones as we walk through their actions on the rest of the body and on the other glands in the endocrine system. But even without being familiar with that hormone in specific, you should have a good guess that we're talking about a hypothalamic hormone, one of these tropic hormones, just from the name, just from that naming convention. We'll see that we do have no rules like in the anterior pituitary hormones, but some kind of trends. For example, we have stimulating hormones, right? So we don't have any releasing hormones. We don't have any inhibiting hormones in terms of their name. But a lot of these are also tropic hormones. So instead we use the word stimulating if we mean we're going to make more of the next hormone. So you can see that we have our thyroid stimulating hormone, we have a follicle stimulating hormone, we have a melanocyte stimulating hormone, although we do have some other names that don't follow a specific convention. But if you're trying to figure out if something's from the anterior pituitary or the hypothalamus and you got like two choices, this is hopefully helpful, making it a little bit less work. Okay, so we will walk through some of, I'll just circle them for you now in specific. We'll walk through some of these pathways in detail, but some of them are going to be more important for us than others. You are expected to be familiar with them all kind of generally, but I'm going to just flag them. We're going to talk about the thyroid specifically, so you're going to know the thyroid pathway in detail, hopefully by the end of the unit. We're going to be talking about the adrenal gland again. So we're going to trace this whole cortisol pathway. Cortisol is important for your stress response. Those are going to be the two Most important for this unit, not to say that there can never be a question on any of the others. And the other thing that's going to show up later in the course, this is going to be important for A&P 2 in particular, is this reproductive kind of pathway that leads us to our gonads and ultimately the development of these typical male and female hormones, reproductive and generally regulating reproductive function. So those are your first priorities if you're trying to figure out what to study first. Not to say the others aren't important, but those are the most important. So now we're going to walk through our other primary endocrine organs. So the glands, where the most important thing that they're doing is producing a hormone. So the first one's the pineal gland. Don't think you were asked to point this out in lab, but a cute little gland here that we could see in our mid-sagittal section. So we see this little projection here. And that's where you'd find the pineal gland. This is in the brain itself. So it's a different type of tissue. It's glandular tissue rather than neurons, rather than like central nervous system type tissue in general. So the pineal gland is where you get your natural melatonin. So I know they sell a lot of melatonin gummies for trying to help people with their sleep-wake cycles. That's because we think that the pineal gland and melatonin might be, probably are related in circadian rhythms. So your sleeping and waking cycles. Not exactly clear cut how this works. There are other things that affect your sleep-wake cycle kind of dramatically. But that's why we're taking melatonin gummies, is to try and tell our bodies what our sleep-wake cycle should be. Your pineal gland should be doing this based on how you sense light coming in through your eyes during the day. What is definitely clear about melatonin in the pineal gland is that this plays an important role in like seasonal processes in mammals other than ourselves. So if you think about things that like hibernate, right, this is an important gland for them in particular. That's basically all we're going to say about the pineal gland before we move on to our thyroid. So we're kind of walking down the body as we go through these glands. So pineal gland up in the brain. Now we're moving to the front of your neck, the anterior portion of the neck, where we find our thyroid gland. Okay. So here is our glandular tissue that we're looking at. So you can see it lying on top of your trachea, which is your windpipe, right below your larynx, so that's your voice box. So you can feel about where your thyroid gland should be. Your thyroid gland makes a couple of different hormones. In general, what's happening with the thyroid is we're regulating metabolism. So people have like hypothyroidism, right? This affects their metabolism, it affects like how they produce fat, how they produce energy, because these thyroid hormones are really critical in making sure that we're doing that how we want to be doing that. Okay. So there are two types of thyroid hormones that we're ultimately going to look at the end of this pathway. Okay, so we've got T3 and T4. So T4 is tetraiodothyronine. So tetra for 4, iodo for iodine, and thyronine for the thyroid. Okay. This is the more common one. Because it's the more common one, it does also have another name. As you can see, that name's kind of long. So thyroxine is another way that this is referred to. This is 90% of your thyroid hormones. But we also have T3 making up the other 10%. T3, or triiodothyronine, is a little more active actually when it gets to target tissue. So think about it as like a little more effective when it gets where it's going, but there's less of it. Okay. So we're working together to regulate your metabolism. Another thing coming from the thyroid gland is something called calcitonin. So this has kind of a separate role. This is helping us regulate calcium levels. And that's also going to be kind of integrated with our parathyroid glands, which will be the next one we take a peek at that kind of sit on the back of the thyroid gland. Okay. So this is our summary of how the whole pathway works if we're going to make these thyroid hormones. Okay. I'll walk on the side through what it takes to get here before we get to the thyroid. Okay. All right, so this is one of those pathways coming from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. All right, so we'd start in the hypothalamus. We're going to start with secreting this TRH, right? So our thyroid releasing hormone. Okay. Then we pop down to the anterior pituitary through that portal system. We're going to release our thyroid stimulating hormone. And then we get to the thyroid itself. Ultimately, we're trying to release this T3 and T4. Okay. Some of the T4 can be turned into T3 at target tissue. So what's going on in the gland itself, in that thyroid gland? Okay. So when we get the signal to make these two hormones, right, we're going to be getting the signal from the blood, right? So we can see this thyroid stimulating hormone here in the blood. So that's our signal, right? And it's going to act on stuff that is already in our thyroid gland. Okay. So here on the inside of the thyroid gland, right, in a region we call the colloid. So here's our colloid, this kind of cavity inside. Okay. We can see that we have this molecule thyroglobulin waiting. So that's the TG here. So this is like our precursor to these two thyroid hormones. Okay. So when we get the signal from our blood, from our tropic hormones, what we're going to do with this thyroglobulin is we are going to change it, right? We're going to modify it. And the way we're modifying it is we're going to be adding a bunch of the iodine, and then we're going to split it apart into T3 and T4. Okay. So we can see some of that pathway here, right? We can see this modification. We don't need to know the details of it, but you can see we're making DIT, MIT, those I's are iodine, right? And we've got this T3 and T4 as those merge together, right? And then we split it up into T3 and T4 in the colloid, but we're pulling the part that has this T3 and T4 created into these outer cells of the thyroid gland. So these outer cells are labeled as our follicular cells. So these are the part of the thyroid that's touching your bloodstream, basically. Okay. And ultimately, we're going to break up these molecules that are still kind of stuck together and release them separately into the bloodstream, where they can head off to other parts of your body and do their metabolism regulating functions. Okay. This is a place where we have feedback loops. So think homeostasis, think feedback loops. In specific, what we're looking at is the T4, so that more common hormone that we produce from the thyroid. Once we make a lot of it, your body wants to stop making thyroid hormone. You don't want to burn tons of energy super fast and like starve yourself by producing too much thyroid hormone. That's not good either. All right, so we go back. We have this long loop feedback to the hypothalamus. So this is negative feedback. So once we have enough T4, we turn off this signal coming from the hypothalamus. Okay. Right. So when we think about what does a thyroid hormone look like, what does it do, what properties does it have? One of the things that we're going to notice is it's lipophilic. Steroids are also lipophilic, so we're thinking lipids, right? So this is going to be something that's non-polar, right? We've thought about thinking hydrophobic, now we're talking, or hydrophilic, now we're thinking about things that are attracted to lipids, right? So like attracted to fats also. Okay. So that's one property that a thyroid hormone has. what it's going to do once it gets into a cell, and it can cross into, is it's going to alter how we transcribe mRNA. Right? So basically, it's affecting how we're going from genes to ultimately making proteins as we go from DNA to this messenger RNA to our actual proteins that we make at the ribosomes. Right? So this is important for growth. This is important for energy production. And if you don't have enough of these hormones, especially if you don't have enough of them during development as you're growing as a embryo or as a child, this is going to result in some noticeable diseases. So we can have congenital hypothyroidism, which used to be called cretinism, not really a term we use anymore. So insufficient hormones available, these thyroid hormones during development, have some noticeable effect later in life. Okay. And we're about to talk about how exactly these thyroid hormones are going to be regulating and affecting metabolism in your daily lives. So we want to get a handle on some words that we mentioned briefly before related to metabolism. So we were talking about glucose and glycogen in the past. So right now we want to make sure that we know the word glycogenolysis before we talk about this next bit. All right, let's take a look. Okay, great. Yeah, so what we're looking at when we see this word glycogenolysis, you're noticing that we have glycogen in it. And we have this lysis ending telling us that we're breaking down glycogen. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to see with our thyroid hormones is that we're going to be breaking down a lot of stuff more quickly in response to thyroid hormones. Right? So one of the things we'll break down more is glycogen, hence the glycogenolysis. We'll also break down more proteins, so proteolysis, and more lipids, lipolysis or lipolysis, right? Because overall, what we're doing is making more ATP, right? We're making available energy for the body, okay? So we are going to be upscaling all sorts of stuff related to metabolism. So we're going to be increasing how fast our sodium potassium pumps are working. We're going to be increasing how many mitochondria we have, how big our mitochondria are. They can actually vary in size. We know the mitochondria are important for our aerobic cellular respiration, right? So breaking down glucose to make ATP, using oxygen as our final electron acceptor, right? So that's the process of oxidative phosphorylation at the end of our aerobic metabolism there. So we're also going to be making more of the enzymes related to oxidative phosphorylation, right? So we're setting up all these pieces that are going to make our metabolism work more quickly with these thyroid hormones. And then we're also breaking down larger molecules for energy, right? So we're breaking down our glycogen, which is basically a bunch of glucose molecules glued together, plus proteins, plus lipids. We know there are pathways for using energy or for getting energy out of those molecules as well. Okay. But we're not even done yet, right? We're going to be making new glucose. So gluconeogenesis, right, is for glucose, new, and creation. So creating new glucose. So gluconeogenesis. So we have more glucose we can use for energy. and even making ketones that we can use for energy. Along the way, we are also going to be making some more receptors. We're going to be changing our responsiveness to the sympathetic nervous system, to things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So we're going to be making new beta adrenergic receptors, right? We know those beta adrenergic receptors are the ones that activate cyclic A&P, so activate that second messenger inside target cells so that cells have a reaction when your sympathetic nervous system activates. Okay. So it's all kind of working together to have this overall kind of burning stuff more effect. Okay. So we also have another gland here, sitting really attached to the thyroid gland that has a different effect, right? So here we see where your parathyroid glands are, right? Their role is really important, but really simple, or at least simple from our perspective of what we want to know about it. Okay, so instead of being involved in these thyroid gland calorogenic metabolism activities, what the parathyroid glands are doing is they're helping to regulate calcium levels in the blood. So we've already seen that calcium concentrations are important for our neurons because we know that calcium coming into a neuron is what allows the neuron to release its neurotransmitter. When we move forward into muscles, we're going to see that calcium is really important for our contraction of muscles as well. So there are lots of parts of your body that rely on specific calcium levels. So your parathyroid is on the back of the thyroid gland. You got like 4 little dots here that do that. You may, if you get like thyroid cancer, have part of your thyroid gland removed, say remove one of these bits that has a parathyroid gland sitting on it. They pick it off and they put it back in your body. And sometimes they just like put it in your arm or something, which I think is kind of neat. They don't always put it back in the neck where it goes, but it is really important that you keep it. So important job, but not a big long pathway that we need to know about right now. The next set of kind of longer, more complex pathways that we're going to focus on are going to be coming from our adrenal glands. So we're going to think about our glucocorticoids. Right. So we've seen the adrenal gland before, sitting on top of your kidneys. Okay. Got this little pyramid-like structure. And when we were talking about it before, we were talking about the sympathetic nervous system. We were talking about the inside part, that adrenal medulla. Right? That was one of the ways that we can get these neurotransmitters and hormones related to the sympathetic nervous system out to the body. We have those modified postganglionic neurons called chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla that produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. Now, that's all the way on the inside of our adrenal gland, but our adrenal gland also has this outer shell, right? So this is our cortex. This is the adrenal cortex, is this whole outer layer. So that's what we're thinking about now as we think about this endocrine function, right? So there's a primary endocrine gland, and we think about the adrenal cortex as a really important part of that. So the adrenal gland, in addition to linking up with the sympathetic nervous system from that adrenal medulla part, produces from this adrenal cortex, right, you're going to notice cort in all of these, corticoids, even in the word cortisol, right? This is telling you it's coming from that cortex part of the adrenal gland. Right? We got groups of them. Right? So your adrenal gland, really important to endocrine functioning throughout your body. We have mineralocorticoids that regulate sodium and potassium levels. We talked extensively about sodium and potassium. You know, they're super important for nerves. We know we have these sodium potassium pumps throughout your body. They make all kinds of stuff for function. So our mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, which we'll talk about when we talk about the kidney, help us regulate the levels of sodium and potassium. What we're going to focus on more right now are our glucocorticoids. Okay. So glucocorticoids, which is cortisol, are going to be regulating the body's response to stress, and they're going to be regulating metabolism right along with that. Okay. So that's what we're going to be thinking about as our kind of primary interest in the adrenal cortex for this unit. But we're not done with hormones coming from the adrenal gland yet. When we think about the full picture, we also want to know that the adrenal gland is also making some sex hormones. So your adrenal gland actually also makes androgens. So like, you think about the fact that women also have testosterone naturally, right? That's like part of it, is that some of those androgens don't just come from gonads, don't just come from the reproductive system. Some of them come from the adrenal gland. So that helps us regulate reproductive function as well. So this is just a reminder about that adrenal medulla, right? So we had these chromaffin cells on the inside part of the adrenal gland. They're making epinephrine and norepinephrine and a tiny amount of dopamine. The biggest thing they're making by proportion is the epinephrine. So epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. This is named for this gland. Okay? And we know that's directly under neural control. We know that's part of one of our sympathetic nervous system pathways. Okay. So let's focus instead now, since we know our sympathetic nervous system, we know those pathways, on how we get to making our glucocorticoid cortisol. Okay. Our glucocorticoid cortisol is important in our kind of global stress response, okay, among other things. Okay? This is also actually going to be important to your circadian rhythm, to stress-wake cycle. I don't think it's very nice, but part of what wakes you up in the morning is actually a spike in cortisol. How do we get there? Okay. So our influence ultimately for producing more cortisol from our adrenal cortex is stress or time, so your circadian rhythm, daylight, nighttime cycles, affecting the hypothalamus. So from the hypothalamus, we have one of those releasing hormones. Okay? So here we have corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. Right, so we're going to the adrenal cortex. This is a tropic hormone, and we're releasing a hormone. Right, that's how we get that name. So corticotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. It goes down through the portal system into the anterior pituitary. So this is our hypothalamic pituitary axis. And when we say axis, like we're thinking through line. That's a kind of formal way we refer to these pathways. Okay. So when we get to the anterior pituitary, we stimulate ACTH secretion. So we had to come up with another name, but we can see that we are still kind of just talking about what happens at the end of the pathway. Right. So here we're making cortisol from the adrenocortex. So adrenocortico, this is again a tropic hormone. That's how we get our name. Mouthful, so we usually say ACTH here. Okay. We make that from the anterior pituitary, it goes into the bloodstream. Okay. Then it heads down through your bloodstream. Ultimately, some of this is going to get to your adrenal gland, to the adrenal cortex, and that's where we make our cortisol. Okay. And we can see that there are negative feedback loops attached to this cortisol secretion as well. We don't want to make cortisol forever. We don't want to have this huge stress response. We want to have a little bit. We want to have just enough to adapt to stress. So once we have a lot of cortisol, hopefully we are turning that off on two levels. We've got a pathway turning off what's going on in the anterior pituitary. So one level of negative feedback. Then we've got our long loop negative feedback heading all the way back up to the hypothalamus, telling us that we have enough cortisol, we can stop making it. All right. So what does this do once we have our cortisol, once we have these glucocorticoids? Okay. So we think of cortisol as the hormone of stress, right? Very linked in with that. Should be the first thing that kind of pops to mind when you think about cortisol. Regulated by this axis that we've just discussed. So when we say this is our CRH ACTH axis, we're just talking about that pathway that we just went through. Okay. What it's going to be doing, similar to some of the stuff that was happening with the thyroid hormone, right? So not the exact same action, but our overall effect. Right? One thing we're doing is we're going to be mobilizing energy stores. Right? So we want to break down more stuff. We want to get more energy. Right? If you're in a stressful situation, right, this links in pretty nicely, pretty critically with your fight or flight response, right? If you're in a stressful situation, you want to be able to deal with it, right? So we need more energy. So we're mobilizing our energy stores. The other thing that we're going to do here is, interestingly, our cortisol also suppresses your immune response. So it kind of deactivates your immune system a little bit, puts a pause on that, stops like inflammation. So this is why like things like cortisone shots are a little bit related to this cortisol system, right? Because what we're really focusing on is we don't care about fighting pathogens. We don't want too much inflammation right now. We want to run away from stuff. We want to fight stuff. That's where we're putting all our energy when we get this cortisol signal. Okay. So we do have something that we think of as a stereotypical response to stress that links together a bunch of different parts of our endocrine system. Okay. So we think of this as the stress response, and we call it general adaptation syndrome. So we're generally adapting to stress, right? So one thing that's going to be happening, first bullet point, right? We've just said that we're releasing cortisol in response to stress. And so this is a piece of our stress response, this immediate or automatic response to stressful situations or the body being in stress. This is going to be paired with increased signaling from your sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight part of the nervous system, right? So that has similar function, right? So cortisol, we're mobilizing our energy stores, our sympathetic activity. We're regulating a lot of effector organs, but again, getting ready for fight or flight, your heart's beating harder, beating faster, you're changing your breathing, you're getting ready to do stuff. We're going to make epinephrine, right? So epinephrine, adrenaline, same thing, right? So we'll talk later on about how this affects things like your blood pressure, right? But this is linked in with that sympathetic activity because we know that epinephrine is being made by the adrenal medulla from the chromatin cell, right? So hand in hand, inextricably linked to that sympathetic activity here. We're also going to be releasing even more hormones from other parts of the body. So we have ADH and angiotensin 2. So we're going to see that these are involved with blood pressure as well later on when we talk about how we regulate blood pressure, largely using the kidneys. And our overall goal, right, is to be able to fight something or to run away from something, which means we need lots of ATP, right? So that's the mobilization of energy stores piece. And also, like, we want to maintain blood pressure. So to understand that, when you think about, you've been sitting down for a long time or lying down, relaxing on your bed, and you suddenly stand up. Have you ever felt that, like, how your vision kind of goes gray situation? Yeah. So that's because of a drop in blood pressure in your brain. Your body automatically corrects it, right? So hopefully you should immediately get that blood pressure to your brain back up. But you can kind of sense that effect of feeling a little woozy when you don't have enough blood pressure in your body, right? So maintaining your blood pressure is important to being able to run away from stuff or fight stuff. And it's also important for making sure that you get lots of oxygen out to the muscles that you're using, right? So we want to maintain steady blood flow, lots of blood flow in order to be up and active. So we've got lots of things working together in this stress response. Cortisol is important, and we've got these other pieces linked to that. A little bit more. So we'll go over some pieces of the pancreas. Again, we're just kind of walking our way down the body. We've done pineal gland in the brain, thyroid and parathyroid about here in your neck. Your adrenal glands are maybe like here-ish, kind of on the back. And now we're moving into the pancreas, which is about here, kind of sitting tucked behind and a little bit below your stomach. Okay. So your pancreas is going to have both an endocrine part that's involved with hormones and regulation, and an exocrine part that's going to be involved with digestion. Okay? So it's got two pieces here. Okay? So when we look at the pancreas, we've got different cell types, and you would hopefully be able to tell that they are different and doing different things. Right? So we've got exocrine cells right out here, these kind of darker ones. Okay. And then we're going to have endocrine cells, specifically in these lighter patches called islets of Langerhans. So we're going to have these two things working in the pancreas, both of which are really important. We're going to go over the exocrine bit first, just so you know what it is. We're going to be focusing on those enzymes in A&P2. So for right now, what you really want to know about the exocrine pancreas is that that's not the endocrine part that we're focusing on in this unit. Okay. But we do have in that exocrine pancreas, which makes most of the cells, it's like a larger part of the pancreas, acinar cells, which are more kind of globule cells, and duct cells. We have a series of tubes, that's the duct cells. They make enzymes for digestion. They make fluid that helps with digestion and helps with maintenance of some other stuff in your digestive system, which we'll go into the details of later. Okay. And they have a duct that goes from the pancreas into your small intestine. Okay. But our focus for right now is the endocrine part of the pancreas. So we're zooming in on those tail parts, the islets of Langerhans, and we're going to see that we have hormones that regulate how your body is processing energy when you're hungry versus when you've just eaten, basically, is what's happening here with the endocrine part of the pancreas. So if we look at the cells of those endocrine part of the pancreas, right? Exocrine cells are the yellow part on the outside. We're zooming in here. Okay? We're going to have alpha cells. We're so creative, right? Alpha, A. We're going to have beta cells. Beta for B. I don't know why they skipped C. Maybe that's not the next one in Greek. I don't actually know Greek. But our next cell we're going to think about are our delta cells. Okay. There are also F cells. We gave up on Greek at this point. So we got our F cells. Sorry, I'm assuming that's what happened as they discovered them. You can ask an endocrinologist about that. I just know that's what we got there. Okay. All right. We're going to be thinking in this unit mostly about the alpha and beta cells. So from our alpha cells, we've got a hormone called glucagon. From our beta cells, we probably have our more famous hormone, insulin. Pancreas produces insulin, right? Really important. Delta cells are making something called somatostatin, and our F cells are making pancreatic polypeptide. We're not going to think extensively about those in this minute, but we are going to think about glucagon and insulin and how they have opposite actions. And in this way, really toggle you well between our kind of fasting states and well-fed states. Okay. We're going to just preview this. I know we got like 2 more minutes. We'll focus deeply on these things next time, but I just want to make sure we've got like a little bit of terminology before we get there. So when we talk about the actions of insulin and glucagon, what we're going to be thinking about are the differences between formally our absorptive and post-absorptive state. So our absorptive state is going to be while you're absorbing nutrients, right? Your post-absorptive state is later on. Maybe you're getting hungry, maybe you're not so hungry, but it's been a long time since you since you ate. Your post-absorptive state, you're going to be focused on making sure that you still have energy for things like your brain and all the stuff your body is doing. So we're going to have a storage state when we've got extra energy coming into your body, our storage state, and we're going to have a burning stuff state, this post-absorptive state. They're going to be regulated by levels of insulin and glucagon, and we'll talk about those on Friday.